So first of all, I just love if you could just tell me a little bit about yourself and your background. Just
Okay. So I'm actually from Indiana, so I'm a Midwesterner, but did my PhD at University of Michigan, and then had my first position in Chinese history. So I did my PhD in Chinese history at University of Michigan. During that time, I also did 2 years of research in China from 1981 to 1983. Got my degree in 85, first job at University of Florida for about 8 years, and then moved to George Washington University. I also had another year in China, 91 to 92, doing more research, and spent 2 years in Taiwan in the 70s. So 5 years kind of like living in East Asia, China stuff.
great. So specifically, I'd love to ask you a little bit more about your experience with Confucius
Uh-huh,
Institutes. It's also something that I'm really personally interested in. I'm a junior at Dartmouth right now,
uh-huh,
studying government and Chinese. And in high school, Confucius Institute, the Confucius Institute at Portland State
uh-huh,
University, specifically in Portland, really helped me learn Chinese language and culture. And I went with them on their summer bridge program to
yeah,
China. So I'm curious to hear more of your
yeah,
thoughts on that too.
yeah. Well, we actually first considered, I think, probably back when they first started, maybe 2009 or so, uh, but turned it down at that first. We were very skeptical at the beginning, um, and there were serious problems at the beginning. One of the things I remember is, first of all, a rather big demand for office space. Like we will provide a suite of 4 offices, and like for a university in an urban setting, that's very hard to promise all sorts of space. But the other one was there was a condition. I'm not sure it was in our instructions, but other people told us about how you had to agree to the one China principle before you could get a Confucius Institute, and that just kind of killed it. We weren't going to do that. That we wouldn't take a political stand in it. And I think one of the things that happened with the Confucius Institute that they learned, I mean, it's a learning process on both sides, that the Chinese had to give on something too. And so they gave on that, right? So that was no longer in when we considered again, and we started in 1911 or 2011, and that was gone. That issue was gone. But it still took us a year and a half to do it. So we started in the summer of 2011. It wasn't fully established until January, I think, of 2013. Mainly worked because we had a dean of our College of Arts and Sciences that was very eager to do it. So I don't know if this gets me in some of the questions you had on your sheet of paper, and I'm not sure if I should go on to that, but it was really partially we just wanted to teach more Chinese language. And as you said, like the availability back then, there weren't enough Chinese instructors. There just weren't. And one of the interesting things I found out as we started this process, we were already receiving, I think, 3 Chinese instructors from Hanban, from China, for free already, because our Chinese language people had gone to China and said, look, we're desperate. We have all these students. We don't have enough teachers. And they gave us 3 teachers. And that was with no strings attached, just kind of like, okay, you provide housing for them, we'll pay them and send them over. And so I think that's really where the Confucius Institutes kind of started, is that was this demand from all sorts of schools around the country. And they were learning that if you went to China and begged for teachers, they would send you some. And then, so why not begin to formalize that kind of relationship? And so that's why I think it really is. It was a key moment in time when both sides were very, there was a need, but it's also very accommodating, right? We all, and I think in origin, it was always explained to us that Chinese never expected these things to become permanent ways of teaching Chinese. In other words, China was not taking control of teaching Chinese in America. They simply realized that in the short run, there's not enough teachers. And that part of the things that Confucius Institutes were supposed to do is aid in the creation of more teachers of Chinese. And that would ultimately, we would be teaching Chinese on our own. You would need the Confucius Institutes, or maybe they would shift into something different. So it was, I think, a perfect point in time. And well, also the other thing, of course, is when we were doing this is right, I guess it was in 2009 or so when Obama had his 100,000 strong campaign, where we're going to make sure there's 100,000 American students going to China to do exchanges. And so there was that kind of vibe of the time that this is a time when we should be doing more with China and doing more exchanges. So it all kind of came together for us right at that time. At that time, so my situation in my school is a little bit, we have an odd situation because we have a School of International Affairs, and I'm in the history department in the College of Arts and Sciences, but my position is paid for by the School of International Affairs. So I'm actually a faculty member of the School of International Affairs. And a lot of competition between schools in such a situation, right? So we have a Asia Center in the School of International Affairs. And so, but the languages are taught by Arts and Sciences. So it was kind of a collaborative effort with me kind of representing the School of International Affairs and the Dean of Arts and Sciences who said, oh, yeah, let's look into this. I think none of us thought it would take as long as it did. You thought you'd come up with an agreement, but it was a very kind of, we did a trip to China together with the dean and some of the other people involved and the other faculty and staff to China to look into possible partners, since all Confucius Institutes are, at least officially, a partnership between one institution and another. And we went to Nanjing University and to Wuhan University, and it was supposed to be Wuhan University was the one that was supposed to be selected, but their leadership changed and we ended up with Nanjing University instead. So that was like 1 year after we started, we did this trip, and then they had their people come to us sometime in the first term of, in the fall term of 2012 or 2012. And then finally it wasn't signed until the very end of 2012 and started up in the early part of 2013.
So that's great, just for a bit of historical context. And the second part of my question is just if our readers don't know as much about Confucius Institutes, could you provide a bit of context on what are some of the purposes that they serve at universities across the U.S. and specifically at Georgia and what they do?
So they play a different role in different universities. I think there's one university that's like a music school or something. And so they focus on exchanges involving music. But the heart of it is really language instruction. You can't have a Confucius Institute unless you're doing language instruction. And we actually made a decision that we were also not going to do anything that was contemporary. And I think that's really been true across the board now. I mean, this is concern about, will the Chinese use Confucius Institutes for propaganda? We had one incident at the beginning where they said, well, we have someone from the embassy who come talk about China's current foreign policy. And said, sure, we do that with other people in other countries all the time. We're in Washington, D.C., and ambassadors come and give talks about their country. And you understand that that's what they're doing. They're presenting their country's view. But in doing that, we suddenly realized, okay, this is kind of not good for the Confucius Institute. They have them sponsoring an official from China talking about Chinese policy. People are going to say we're using the Confucius Institute to spread propaganda. So we made a very clear decision. Our policy is that we only do culture and language, right? We don't do anything about contemporary affairs. And the other side of that, of course, is that we have this Asia Center in the International School that does all the contemporary affairs stuff. So we talk about Tibet and Taiwan and Xinjiang and anything else we went to, other parts of the university. So we never envisioned the Confucius Institute to be the center of Chinese studies. It was simply a center that does specific things with language instruction. And that's almost always true. The difference might be between large and small schools. So we're a large university. We have our own Chinese language department. We never had them teach classes in the Chinese language department for credit. And that was, again, a concern that we don't hand over credit teaching classes to non-faculty, right? People. So these are, the people coming from China are faculty at Chinese institutions. But they're not hired as US faculty. They're exchange scholars. And there are cases where all universities do that. So we have a relationship with Boğaziçi University in Turkey, where they send somebody over every couple of years and they teach, and we have them teach regular 4-credit courses. But those are always very carefully vetted within certain departments and so on. And so we decided we wouldn't have them teach regular 4-credit classes. They teach outside classes. Very useful in Washington because there's about 200-300 people a year take classes with our Confucius Institute. It's like people from the State Department or from business groups or private people that want to learn Chinese. Also graduate students who often can't afford college tuition for Chinese language. Tuition is very, very expensive. So if you're doing a master's program and you have a limited amount of funds, you don't want to put half of your money into Chinese language courses. So you can take a Confucius Institute course instead. So I think that's mainly the pattern. In smaller schools, though, where without the Confucius Institute, they would have no Chinese language instruction. In those cases, I think a lot of them are teaching 4-credit classes. So they're incorporated into the College of Arts and Sciences or whatever departmental structure they have. Then on top of that, almost all of them, I think they're almost required to do some cultural stuff, right? So we have lectures on poetry, lectures on calligraphy, demonstrations of calligraphy, demonstrations of art. So that kind of cultural activity. And I think that's also true for almost all Confucius Institutes. Then the other things that they do though, so a lot of them do have these exchange programs where they send students over, which they're, if they have a, I think it's harder for us because Nanjing has a lot of connections. And so they can't have an exchange program with every school they have connections with in terms of sending students back and forth. So in some ways, it's better if you're a smaller school with a smaller partner in China that can actually give you more attention. But also, we have lots of exchange programs already. We've always had lots of exchange programs, and they're very strong. And we wanted to make sure our students always went to programs we were confident about the best language instruction. So we don't do that. But one thing our Confucius Institute does is to actually provide funding for faculty research, research on China. And it's been very good in the sense that we basically decide who gets the money. I think if someone came, we've never had this situation yet, but I think if you had a topic that says, I'm investigating the corruption of the top leadership of the Chinese Communist Party, I want to go to interview corrupt leaders, it probably wouldn't get approved. But that's true for all scholarships that go to China. I've had several scholarships in China, and they review your proposals, and if they don't like it, you don't go. And that's their prerogative. But at least so far, all the funding all the faculty have approached us for funding through our Confucius Institute have been accepted. So it's about 8 or 9 a year. Only this year have we stopped because there's no way to go to China to do the research. So, and in a couple other cases, at least one that I know of, they actually provided funding for a new position in Chinese studies of some sort. I think it was in California somewhere. So some cases got really good deal, where you get an endowed chair, for example. I mean, again, the problem is for the Chinese that they would like to control who gets appointed. No university will allow that, right? You have an open search and you hire who you hire, and then they just have to eat it. So that's not been a common, I think from the Chinese side, they don't see why should we be doing this, right? You should have your own faculty.
Yeah.
So, but I know there's some weird, I think there's some like little dental school that has a Confucius Institute for a while too. So there's some strange ones where very early on, the big schools weren't willing to do it. And because they were worried about what it would look like. And so a lot of little schools got on board that probably shouldn't have, that had very small programs. And I've heard of one recently that closed basically, not because of all the troubles, because the enrollments level was so low, right? There was just, this school was simply too small to have a normal size class in Chinese all the time. And that was 4 credit classes, so they just shut it down. The other side is Confucius Classrooms, which are in high schools and elementary schools, which basically they just send a graduate student in Chinese language instruction over to help run Chinese language programs. And that again is meeting the demand. I know I'm from a little town in Indiana, 20,000 people, and they now teach Chinese. It used to be Greek and Latin and Spanish and German. And now they teach Chinese. So there's this demand that came, and also maybe that's why also this happened. A lot of our students were going to China in these years, the early, like 2009, 2010, 2011, and people were seeing that as a place for jobs, right? But you had to have Chinese. You can't go to Shanghai and get an internship and just do it in English. So the demand, that's where the demand, and so that worked its way down through the educational system, where people say, well, we'd like to have our kids have a head start in getting Chinese in high school. Good luck. There's no language instructors. So the Confucian Classrooms really helped with that as well in providing language instruction. So that I think is the heart of the Confucius Institute's language instruction.
All right. Thanks for that. So my next question is, in recent years, especially since the election of President Trump in 2016, skepticism and backlash towards China has heightened among the American public. So in your opinion, what has contributed to these opinions, and what effect has worsening U.S.-China relations had on people-to-people exchange programs such as the Confucius Institute?
So I don't blame it all on Trump. It was starting before Trump. So when the Confucius Institute started, it was kind of the high point of feel-good times with relationship with China, I think. And I think, like I say, when them, them making some concessions. So they also don't oppose that we don't do political events in the Confucius Institute. It's like a training program you have with people that do academic exchanges with universities. And we do a lot of this in Washington because embassies are always pushing us to do things. And you say, well, you realize if we do this, there's going to be people giving, two opinions of both sides. And people who do that, countries that do that with us all the time realize that's true. China didn't realize that was true. At the beginning, they thought, well, now you have a Confucius Institute, you're going to do what we want, right? And well, no, that's not what we do. So I think they learned that lesson as well. So it was a good time where Chinese were making accommodations. I think in the last few years, maybe going back 2018, there's been a shift in what many, even scholars on the China field, feel about China's relations. So the people that are really behind US policy up to this point, well, again, I think we did this always in American politics. When there was a presidential election, both candidates would say, well, we're going to get tough on China. Well, when they got there, the realities of it was, we knew China was rising anyway. Are we going to oppose that? Or do we help out? So you have this kind of this Thucydides issue, right? The rising power will always conflict with the old powers. And is that what we really were looking forward to? Are we going to set ourselves up for that? And so the decision made by most policymakers at that time and scholars was, it'd be better for us to try to work with China and try to ease them towards integration in the international community. And so that's basically what we did, supporting their entry into the World Trade Organization and all these other organizations, and doing investments in China and allowing all sorts of trade with China. And it was kind of a real handout from the United States to China saying, here, we'd like to help instead of oppose you. Although the Chinese still think we tried to oppose them at every turn, but it's not, that's kind of a historical problem. But the assumption always was that down the road, then China would get integrated in the world system, and that they would open up even more and more. They would make the structural adjustments needed to stay in these organizations. And a growing disappointment by the last couple of years, or actually before Trump, that China was no longer doing that. Things were actually getting tighter. Intellectual property problems, the problems with openness of the Chinese economy to US business, the kind of restrictions they face, needing to have Chinese partners, needing to give up all their patents if they're going to have work with China. So all sorts of issues that basically a feeling that China had stopped structurally its opening process and was tamping down on this stuff. So there was already a growing sense, I think, that China was a problem we needed to do more. So Trump arrives right at that key moment, I think, where there was opinion that the United States needed to start being a little bit tougher on China. The problem was that I don't think he had a real strategy. He didn't have a strategy for this. It was more like, we're going to do it on trade, okay, by doing tariffs that hurt the American people instead of the Chinese. It was like a really wrong-headed policy, but in some ways it fed into that sense we had to do something. And I think the downside of it is that it's turned against things like the Confucius Institute. It's not a strategic policy that we're following now. We're just kind of doing this anti-China policy. And so I think some of it has real base in things like intellectual property, trade, other issues that people are very concerned about in China and Taiwan and Hong Kong and all these other issues. So there's this accumulation of things that people are worried about China, and that turned against the Confucius Institutes as well. However, I see it primarily as almost like a Cold War kind of bias. It's mainly based on accusations and claims that can't be supported, and assumptions that people, we assume these evil things are going on, therefore we have to shut them all down. Instead of saying, what can we do to enhance our relationship, and what can we do to improve places that are in trouble? I can't remember if that really answered all your question. I kind of get carried away.
That was great. Thank you. And then a follow-up to that, as the Carter Center, we're especially interested in President Carter because he's our founder.
Yeah.
So President Carter actually recently wrote to President Biden asking him to encourage more Confucius Institutes to open in the United States. Do you think that opening and reopening Confucius Institutes in the US is feasible in the near future?
I think it would be good. Feasible is another issue because it is political. Right now, what a lot of Confucius Institutes are facing is this threat that you will remove all government funding from your university unless you give up, if you have a Confucius Institute. So you can't now get any Defense Department language awards if you have a Confucius Institute. This is an irrational policy, as near as I'm, the argument kind of is, since you've handed over your Chinese language instruction to the Chinese, and therefore the Chinese are now controlling your Chinese languages, we don't want to support that same language program. It's just crazy, because that's not what's going on. So I think I think what former President Carter did is courageous, because this is like going against the tide. Everybody wants to close the Confucius Institutes now. Everybody wants to be anti-China, but that's not a rational policy. The long-term interest of the United States is not to turn China into Cuba, where we cut off all relations with them and don't do it. I mean, we have to get along with China somehow. And so what you're looking for is ways to do that. And one of the ways that's actually been very successful is actually through the Confucius Institutes. So that's why these people-to-people kind of activities, and of course, this is not a pure people-to-people thing either, right? Nothing with China is purely people-to-people. This is another argument about that Confucius Institutes are run by the Chinese government, therefore we're allowing the Chinese government to do all this stuff. No exchange with China is without political influence, right? If you have an academic exchange in China, there are no independent schools outside of government control. This is like anything you do with China has a connection to the Chinese government. But what we try to do is have exchanges where that people-to-people stuff can happen even under those conditions, and to limit the amount of ways in which the government actually puts limits on those exchanges from both sides. So I think the initiative by Carter is important. I think it's good. I think people should pay attention, because it's one of these successful programs. So it's like throwing out the baby with the bathwater, right? So we had trouble with intellectual property. So let's get rid of the Confucius Institutes. That's not going to make the Chinese go, oh, well, let's change our policy on intellectual property. Need to address the problems as they exist, not try to poke at something else to get back at it.
Right. So following up on that and following up on United Front the Work Department, I'm curious what you think about such initiatives within that department, such as the Chinese Students and Scholars Association, and obviously Confucius Institutes as well, which are to promote the acceptance of CFP's role and kind of endorse its legitimacy. So how would you respond to those programs? And do you believe that China is undermining or trying to undermine?
I think my response is prove it. So as I said, so that's one of the things that the Hanban, so some of the complaint was Hanban claims to be an independent educational association, but it's not. It's run by the government. No educational association in China is independent, right? There's no even NGOs in China, non-governmental associations are run by the government. So anything you're going to deal with, you work with the government. And so they've created a new structure, and all that links up in different ways to the party. That's all true. What the point is, what influence does that have? And so I've pulled up this thing from the Asia Society. If I can get back to it here. At the opening line of their report on that. The report from the Stanford group is really good, that the Asia Society collaborated with the Stanford group. It's really good. But it starts off with the Confucius Institutes provide the Chinese government access to US student bodies. Even though this is supposed to be a summary of that report, I've read that entire report, and that's not what it says. I mean, provides government access to US student bodies. That's a kind of vague charge. What does that actually mean when that statement is meaningless? What, the Chinese government is coming in and doing things to American students or controlling American students somehow? It's a false kind of statement that's very much in fitting with what people say. They assume since the government helps run Hanban, that runs or whatever the organization is now, that helps collaborate with the Confucius Institutes, they must be running the programs. But actually, all these programs have at the minimum 50% American representation, right? So these are collaborative relationships between an institution in China and an institution in the United States with 50% control by the American side. That means there's nothing the Chinese government can do to force Americans to do something they don't want to do. It always has to be a mutual agreement. And what the Chinese have learned through all this is that the Americans are not very agreeable, to anything that might slip over that barrier. So there's another, I forget which one, maybe this is the GAO one, the Government Accountability Office did a study where they said, we found no evidence that the Americans are not in control, right? The American directors are not in control. The Chinese, there's always a Chinese director and an American director. The Chinese director manages the classes, right? So they are professionals who do the language classes. They don't decide policy. They don't decide curriculum on China. They don't control university policy on China. They have almost no influence on the university policy on China. I mean, it's just not so there is no government. It's not a government body. Confucius Institute is not a government body, Chinese government body on the US campus that does things to American students or even propaganda too. Again, that's a very good thing about the Stanford report. My colleague David Shambaugh was on that, and he went to our Confucius Institute and looked through all the materials they provide and could not find any political content. So, and this is generally true. You can't. The arguments that somehow they're using the Confucius Institute to spread propaganda is simply not true. You have to, my answer is, okay, you claim that that's true. Show me where that happened. And we've now had Confucius Institutes for over a decade. You would think that if they were every university and student organizations, right? Where's the evidence? There is none. So I don't really I don't really think these things are threats. I think the Chinese Student Association group is another too. Back when I was a graduate student at the University of Michigan, there were Chinese agents on campus from the Taiwan government, where at any kind of Chinese activity, there were people from the Republic of China. You could always tell they don't always dress bad. They don't dress the right way they're supposed to as students, pretending to be students, but they're kind of eternal students, never go away. And they would take notes on everybody that said anything in there. So it was like a spy operation on these events you want. We have a hard time controlling that. And the same thing happens now, only they actually use the students themselves. I think there's a long history, the link to the party to report what's going on in the class. And so there are these subtle threats they can do to Chinese students to say, you should protest this activity going on in your campus. My sense though, so I worry about the Chinese students more than I worry about our students. Our students know what's going on. No American student goes into a event with, say, the Chinese ambassador giving a speech and says, oh my God, the Chinese are right and we're wrong. It's like our students, they go to China the same way. Going to China for our students, those type of exchange programs are really crucial because you get to see what it's really like. And people don't come back and say, oh my God, I want to be a communist. Actually, because what they see in China is not very much communism anymore. So I think our students are much smarter than that. I don't think these things are, if the Chinese thought this was going to turn people into advocates for China, it's not working. And I think there's been these studies done by, what they are, anyway, about how Americans think about China. And since the start of the Confucius Institutes, American opinions of China have actually gone down, right? So we have all this more activity and all these exchanges and Confucius Institutes and stuff, but the perception of China as the Chinese government is not any better, right? It hasn't improved. Right. So it's not been successful in that sense. I don't think that means there's less interest in China or people like China who go to China. There's a really split between how we see the Chinese government and how we see the Chinese people and how we see Chinese culture. And we've always been fascinated by Chinese culture. We're not so crazy about the government. And our students can do that just as well. I see no indication our students have ever been like somehow turned against their own government because of Chinese propaganda in our schools, because of these different kind of groups. So they try hard, but they don't do a very good job. But they have got this enormous propaganda component now, newspapers that they print. It's almost like the equivalent of the Falun Gong has all these papers too. They're anti-China, right? Nobody takes those things seriously. You're not going to go pick up a Chinese sponsored newspaper in the United States hoping to get the real story, right? You take it with a grain of salt. And almost anybody that reads that knows that. And so if you read it all, it's because you want to see what the Chinese are saying, not because you go, wow, this is where I'm going to get my hard facts here. So I don't see that as an issue. I don't think Confucius Institutes provide legitimacy to the Chinese government. I don't think it provides propaganda. There's just no evidence of that whatsoever. And that people that say that need to do the studies then to prove it.
Yeah, well, thank you for that response on a obviously very complicated topic. So broadening the scope just to chat a bit about people-to-people exchange programs in general, so including maybe the Fulbright or just student exchange programs. In your view, what role do these exchanges play in fostering positive U.S.-China relations?
Yeah. So I think it's really important. I don't think, I mean, maybe in the old days we thought people-to-people exchange could change policy. I'm not really sure if that happens, but it certainly does create better understanding. And I can best put this in my own experience. I started off being, I was doing Chinese history, totally enamored by it, really loved it and everything. But I didn't really understand anything until I went to Taiwan for 2 years. And I finally was having an encounter with a real Chinese society. And so the stuff that were like academically, yeah, I knew this is what Chinese people are supposed to think, really different when you see it on the ground. So I could never really explain one point where that happened, except I knew I had been totally transformed by that experience. And the same thing going off to China. I went in 1981. We were all very much kind of romantics about what Mao had maybe done in the Cultural Revolution. And then you get there and you go, oh my God, you actually talk to people. And that, you got this, without that, I would have been, talking about China in a way that was not based in reality, perhaps. I mean, that experience of living in China for 2 years and experiencing it, good and bad results. You had a much better clarity about how you thought about China, what you said about China, how you taught about China. And I think that's true for all of our students, is that they come away. I think now if you go, you have a much better experience than I had in 1981. It was pretty rough back then. But now it's pretty tremendous. I take some tour groups for the Smithsonian there. And people are always amazed. Of course, they're giving best hotels, best accommodations, all this stuff. So they really, but even then you can just see, you're touring around the cities, you're going down the countryside. Things are really different and better, right? So that's not a bad, should we try to find fault with China? We want to send people over, and we don't want to send people over who are afraid they'll see that China's gotten better. We need people to kind of understand how things really are on the ground. And for our students, that's particularly true. That's the future citizens. They need to understand how to look at other countries and have some kind of empathy for those countries. And I think it works the other direction. One of my main critiques is that we don't take good enough care of the Chinese students who come here. They end up in little groups of Chinese all by themselves. And if you go to, if your students go to China, there's a lot of people interacting with you. And if you're willing to do it, you can also just be in an American bubble too, if you want to. But people are eager to talk to you and work with you. And we are not always so good. We kind of, this is again older days, but when I'd go off to China, they'd meet you at the airport and take you to your dorm and take care, they took care of everything for you. And when the Chinese students first came here, they'd say, well, who's going to meet me at the airport? And said, meet you at the airport? We don't do that. Just show up and then look for some housing for yourself. And you're like, they've never done anything like this before. They've never rented an apartment. Their English is weak. And they're being told, just show up at the airport, take a taxi into town and start looking for an apartment. And then show up on the first day of school. There will be a little orientation on your classes. And they're kind of in a panic. And so the Chinese students basically did that for each other. Old people already there would help the new students coming in. And so we lose an opportunity there by not having more ways to communicate with the Chinese students. And if you look back with our relationship with Taiwan, almost all the political leadership in Taiwan came to America first for studies. And that had a major impact on, they were much better integrated in our society because there were a smaller number of them than the Chinese students are today. And they went back to Taiwan and did democracy, right? It's this influence where they saw how they could actually see how it worked and what it meant, and they took it back with them. We could do the same thing with Chinese students. So I don't think it's a matter of just how it helps our students, but I think it helps our students tremendously as citizens. It also helps their people, understand the United States. And at some level, maybe it's not incremental, though eventually all millions of Chinese are going to show up here and will change all their minds. But incrementally, it influences the people that are most important, the people who are going to take leadership positions. And so I think it's very valuable.
And then my final question is, moving into the Biden administration, what steps do you think the U.S. should take to improve the state of people-to-people exchange between the U.S. and China?
Well, I do think so. Some things I think this attack on Confucius Institutes has to stop, but it's not going to. There's so much pressure in the Congress to, and almost everybody seems to be afraid to say anything Chinese is to be supported. So I'm very pessimistic about that. But on the other hand, there's ways in which we have to. I think the Stanford report or the Asian Society report also talks a lot about reciprocity. That we now need to look more about reciprocity. And I have an example of that. One of my students was given a Fulbright to go to China, and which is a really, this is a good thing, right? To have Fulbrights. And before she arrived, her school sent a message saying, "Oh, we've just received a new regulation for the government, and that is that no foreign student coming to study in China is allowed to study any social aspects of Chinese society or political aspects of Chinese society." Okay, so she's a person looking at immigration issues. That was her. That's what she wrote her project on. That's what was accepted. And now you're not allowed to look at anything involving Chinese people, and also you would not be able. And this is somewhat return to what I experienced when we first went there in '81. The same kind of restrictions. We're not going to give you access to anything. No one's going to talk to you. Also, and of course they did. Once you get there, beyond it, and people find some way to do it. On the other hand, once they start turning it into regulations that they feel like they have to tell you, Chinese students come here and don't have those restrictions, right? So, I mean, it's the same way I think in kind of business exchange relationships. Instead of heavy-handed, let's do tariffs. Let's look at what the actual problems are, and if the Chinese are doing something to us, what can we do back? I remember one case where they're complaining about our treatment of the Huawei thing, that all that China's asking for is a level playing field in the United States. Why can't the United States have a level playing field for Chinese companies in the United States? And our response would be, well, why can't American companies have a level playing field in China? Right? That that some way, that's what we always hoped would happen, right? That the two sides would balance out somehow. And the sense is that Chinese are not balancing anymore. And that they might end up using their dominance in certain areas to actually turn the tables against us. So it has to be more of a attention to specific areas of conflict that are resolvable in terms of things like trade and educational exchanges and so on. China would not normally let us open up, George Washington Institutes in Chinese universities. We allow Confucius Institutes. So the Confucius Institute, you might say, is a good step, but then how are the Chinese going to reciprocate on that? And we need to have those kind of conversations.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So those are all the questions I had. Just out of curiosity, what is happening with the Confucius Institute at George Washington?
We're having a meeting tomorrow. I'm on the advisory committee for it still. So I don't know I think the pressure, we've been very strong in support of it so far. We have had none of the problems that people talk about in terms of propaganda or spying or any of these kind of issues. And if you look at the schools that are closing them down, it's usually for pragmatic reasons, right? So like the school I mentioned, that they didn't have enough language, people want to take the language. But also you see them closing down, and sometimes reported as, due to the pressure about the Chinese who are doing propaganda, they decided to close it down. But the pressure about propaganda is not the same as actual propaganda. If you look at the statements of the schools, they often say, due to the pressure from the government and our legislature and our senators who condemn us for having these Confucius Institutes, and because they're going to cut off our Department of Defense funding unless we get rid of it, we're going to get rid of it. But we'll try to keep doing other things in other ways. So there's this. I think that we might also be forced to close our institute down if it's a matter of, or lose federal funding, and which is where it's going. There's another way of pressure they tried to do, which is to say anybody that receives over X amount of money from China has to do a report on what that money is. Actually, the problem, I think, was that most Confucius Institutes don't receive that much money. There's some kind of this crazy idea that they're pouring millions of dollars a year into these institutes. It's about $100,000 a year, I think. And that was way under the limit they said. Like, it was $250,000, I think. So, and besides, no one would object to that, right? It's like, that's not going to stop them simply to give a report. Sure, we'll report on what money we receive if you feel that's necessary. And the other side of that is that in all these relationships, it's a 50-50. If China gives us $100,000, we have to put $100,000 into it, right? So it's a cost for the university as well. So in that sense, it's not like such an enormous benefit that you do anything for the Chinese to get this money, because we're also putting into it. So if it goes away, it's not really a disaster. We will continue to teach Chinese. We'll still have Chinese programming. So I think it's a real call for the university. Like, the Confucius Institute does a lot of good, and we're teaching all these students in the community. This is a service to the community, that a lot of people in Washington want to learn Chinese, and this gives them a way to do that. But if the government's going to say, we're going to shut down, some resources you get from the federal government, as long as you continue that Confucius Institute, of course we'll shut it down. But that strikes me of something that a communist state might do, that kind of using politics to interfere in education. So I'm not sure what will happen with our institute. We are, at this point, all of our people are committed to continuing, but I think the administration will have to make a decision based on the pressure from the government. If the pressure from the government and the economic costs become too high, then we'll have to shut it down.
Yeah, well, hopefully you can keep it open. I know at PSU, the Portland State Confucius Institute I mentioned earlier, I think they're having issues, and I'm kind of worried they're going to shut down, which is sad for me personally, just because I've used their resources for so many years. Even in college, I use it for like tutoring. I'm planning to take the HSK next year, and I was going to do that through the Confucius Institute. So we'll see.
Well, sometimes these universities come under, or schools come under pressure from their alumni too, and donors. So it is, that's a stakeholder that you have to pay attention to. And I think the problem is there's so much misinformation about the Confucius Institutes that's just wrong. But if everybody believes it, and all your alumni get together and say, we demand that you withdraw this Confucius Institute from your campus, and you're going to alienate your entire alumni association, you'd probably do it. It is there's a cost ratio you have to think about here. And that's, I think, that the level of misinformation, one thing that drives me crazy is the American Association of University Professors put out the statement several years back about how all Confucius Institutes have secret clauses in them that force them to do things, to follow the Chinese government's will in different ways. And since I was involved in ours and I saw the contract, which was confidential, most of all of our donor contracts are confidential. Most donors don't want to have the details spread about. But I saw it, and our faculty saw it, and there was no hidden conditions in that. And so I actually contacted the head of the committee that did that, and I said, where did you get that information from? He said, oh, well, it's just common knowledge in the press. And I said, well, did you talk to any Confucius Institutes at all about this? We didn't see the need. And so it was kind of shocking for me. He basically said, I think it's up to the Confucius Institutes to prove what we said is not true, not for us to prove what we said was true. That's a really contorted kind of un-American thing, I think. And so this idea that you can make those statements, then it gets repeated over and over again. Confucius Institutes are forced to do the will of the Chinese government because they sign agreements that say they have to do this. And the Government Accountability Office got a hold of 90 of those agreements. So that they're confidential, but if you ask them for it, people will show you. And they got a hold of 90 of them, which is about all of them in the United States, and they didn't find a single example to support that charge. So that's the kind of stuff, though, but then it's out there. I keep seeing it in the press over and over again. Since we know that they all have these agreements, and so you get that in the alumni, and they say, well, I've got this evidence here from, a responsible newspaper that says they all have these agreements, and you have one, you need to shut it down. And I think that kind of pressure from your stakeholders can sometimes have drastic and terrible outcomes.